final speaker for our panel today is Professor Somin, Somin, right? I did right, see? Okay. Somin. You're just messing with me. Messing with me.
He's a troublemaker, don't worry.
Keep me straight here. All right. He received his JD also from Yale Law School in 2001. Before joining George Mason University School of Law in 2003, he clerked for the Honorable Jerry Smith of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Professor Somin has published articles in the Yale Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, Georgetown Law Journal, and numerous other legal journals. He's also published in more non-academic press, in the Los Angeles Times, in the Wall Street Journal, as well as a number of legal blogs, and has been quoted and interviewed with such newspapers as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, as well as others. This time I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Somin, who will be talking about democracy, federalism, and dissent. Thank you so much.
So, unlike the previous speaker, I'm an introvert and I'm really bad at organization, which is why I appreciate it when other people do good organization for me. So I'm very grateful to everyone at the University of Tulsa Law School for doing such a great job of organizing this event. I think certainly it's very impressive what you've been able to accomplish here in that regard. I'm also, of course, very grateful to Heather Gerken for providing the subject for this symposium and doing such amazing work in the areas of democracy and federalism, which also happen to be a high proportion of my own research interests. I think in legal academia, we often find it easy to sort of primarily talk to the people that largely already agree with us. After all, it's very easy to persuade those people that you're right. Why? Because they already believe that you're right in the first place, right? So you don't actually have to do that much persuasion. I think the important and powerful thing about Heather's work is that she actually has a lot to say to people, including people like me, who really don't agree with her to begin with, come from very different premises, but yet she's still successful in influencing us in many ways, and that's much more impressive than what you often see in academia, where you're essentially sort of speaking to the choir and telling them things they already believe and already know that they want to hear. In my presentation, I'm going to focus particularly on two aspects of Heather's work, which are also very important to my own work. One is the theory of federalism all the way down. The second is her argument's already been talked about a bit today, that federalism, contrary to conventional wisdom in the legal academy, is actually good for various kinds of political minorities and is their friend rather than their enemy. In my first part of the presentation, I'll expound a bit on what I think is important and powerful about Heather's ideas in this area. In the second, I will propose three extensions of her ideas. Sandy Levinson, who is here with us today, is famous, among other things, for talking about Protestant and Catholic constitutional interpretation. Some of my own work, particularly a forthcoming article I have in Nomos, which is an interdisciplinary journal, which actually next year's issue is all about federalism and subsidiarity. Although I didn't conceive of it in this way beforehand, I think it can also almost be viewed as Talmudic interpretation of Heather's previous work, in that the point of the Talmud is that the rabbis who wrote it are trying to interpret what is meant by the Torah and trace out the Torah's implications for various aspects of our lives. So this particular article, that wasn't my original point, but it can be seen as a kind of Talmudic application of Heather's version of the Torah, sort of the Gerken Bible, so to speak, and I would be sort of in the role of the rabbi trying to explain what the implications are. Now, there is an important difference, and that is, so far at least, God has not yet responded to the rabbis and explained where they went wrong in the Talmud, whereas Heather, fortunately, will get the chance to explain where it is that her Talmudic interpreters have gone wrong. So it's possible that not all of these ideas will be ones that she will agree are good extensions of her theories, but in my view, even if they're not in accordance with her original intent, to borrow a term from constitutional interpretation, I think they are in accordance with the original meaning and the spirit of Heather Gerken, even if not the original intent. And the three extensions are, first of all, that I think it's important in this theory to have a role not just for voting at the ballot box as a way of dissenting by deciding, but also for voting with your feet in the federal system. And in many ways, I think that's as good, in some ways actually superior, to voting at the ballot box. And an integrated theory of federalism all the way down, and federalism's benefits for minorities must take account of voting with your feet. Second, I would argue that Heather's overall theory is more consistent with a constitution as at least some fairly strict limits on the scope of federal power, as opposed to one where Congress has nearly unlimited scope, as it does under the dominant interpretation of the U.S. Constitution since the New Deal. Finally, Heather's view, at least in her writing, seemed to be that the benefits of federalism for minorities in the United States are of relatively recent origin. She accepts most of the conventional wisdom about American history and federalism, which is that historically federalism has been bad for minorities. To my mind, I think it's necessary to reevaluate some of this history more thoroughly in light of Heather's argument, and it will turn out that the picture is much more complicated than is traditionally believed. So first, Heather's contributions, a big one I want to start off with is the idea of federalism all the way down. Heather points out, I think very correctly, that many of the benefits of federalism are often claimed could be enjoyed more fully if we decentralize power not just to the level of the 50 states, but also to local governments, various special government organizations, and the like. And among these benefits that you get the advantage of diversity to a greater extent. So one of the benefits of federalism is that people have diverse preferences. Some people prefer different kinds of governments than others. Obviously, you have a lot more diversity with thousands of local governments than you do with just the 50 states. I think that's a pretty powerful and important point. Second, local governments, at least much at a time, can be more flexible than the state governments. Obviously, the state governments have set boundaries. They have political structures which are very difficult to change. At the local level, we can adjust boundaries. Often we can adjust the political structures and many other things. And I think this flexibility also matters. Third, as Heather points out, with this greater variety of local governments, that gives greater opportunities for minorities and dissenters of various kinds to actually rule and exercise political power, as opposed to merely being supplicants to the federal government or trying to persuade the majority or even the majority at the state level to go their way. I think this ties directly into her theme about federalism and its benefits for minorities as well, which is you see both in her academic work and also in her very important recent article in Democracy about progressive federalism. And here she questions the conventional wisdom about American federalism, which is primarily that it's bad for minorities. This is not just the view of your father's federalism, as she puts it, in academia, but even this is the version of federalism that you probably learn as early as elementary school or high school. If there's one thing you know about federalism, it's that states' rights was and perhaps still is a code word for racism. The face of federalism is Bull Connor, the evil police chief who was oppressing African Americans in the South. It's not sort of a beneficial view of federalism that benefits minorities. Heather, however, emphasizes that federalism can benefit minorities because it allows dissenters to actually decide political issues as opposed to merely express their views. A group which is a minority at the national level can be a majority at the local level, and they can not only express their views but actually live them and experiment with them. John Stuart Mill in On Liberty famously wrote about the importance of experiments in living, people actually trying out dissenting ideas to see if they work. Heather is a kind of John Stuart Mill into federalism literature. She says we need to have experiments in living with respect to federalism so that minorities can actually try out their ideas. Now, there is a reason why in the United States, in contrast to many other countries, we have viewed historically federalism as being the enemy of minorities. In most other federal systems, the federal structure exists precisely because we have a group that's a minority at the national level, but is a majority at the local or regional level. Our neighbor Canada is a great example of this. Their federal system exists in large part because French Canadians are a majority in Quebec, but a minority at the national level. In contrast, in the U.S., most of our big national minorities are also minorities at the state level, African Americans being the best known example, but also Asian Americans, Hispanics, and others. So transferring power to the states, leaving some autonomy to them, doesn't necessarily give them a space where they're the majority. However, Heather in her work points out that thanks to recent changes in American politics and demographics, you actually do have more of these types of situations where minorities are in fact the majority, or at least wield tremendous clout at the local or the state level. Obviously, in many big cities, for instance, there are either African American majorities or large enough African American populations that they wield tremendous power. Gays and lesbians also have a good deal of power in cities like San Francisco and others, where they're a large part of the population. An example she doesn't mention, but which is relevant, I think, is the case of Mormons in Utah. Maybe you do mention it somewhere. I haven't seen it run across in your work. Obviously, Mormons are about 60% of the population in Utah. They've certainly left their imprint on that state, and at the national level, throughout much of American history, Mormons actually were an oppressed and persecuted minority, and so Utah actually is the one long-standing American example of a situation similar to that of federal systems in other countries, where we have a persecuted and disliked minority, which is a majority in a particular state. And of course, the growing power of Hispanics in many jurisdictions is another example of this. I think the case of gay rights perhaps deserves particular attention here because it's dramatic and clear that over the last 10 years, we have had 6 or 7 states adopt gay marriage, and that almost certainly would not have happened if marriage law were federalized in the United States and there was a single unitary national decision on it. Gay marriage would still be a very long way off in the future at this point, if not for federalism. The examples of gays and lesbians also is interesting in that it shows that to have this kind of clout at the local level, you don't necessarily have to be a majority. Even in San Francisco or near where I live in a DuPont Circle neighborhood, gays and lesbians, I think, are not the majority group, but they're a large enough minority, and the majority is sympathetic enough that they still have a lot of clout and therefore can influence the political outcomes in a way that they generally cannot at the level of the federal government. So I think both federalism all the way down and Heather's work about minorities are very important contributions, but as great as they are, they could be even better with the Talmudic extensions that I'm about to present. The first of which is that in Heather's work, she overwhelmingly focuses on the benefits to minorities and other groups of voting with the ballot box at the state or the local level. To my mind, voting with your feet is as much or more important to advancing the beneficial purposes that Heather argues for. What is voting with your feet? It's simply that if you dislike, for whatever reason, the policies of your state or your locality, you can move to another state, another locality where the policies are more favorable to you. And this has some very important advantages over ballot box voting as a method for benefiting minorities and more generally exercising political freedom. One obvious advantage is that you don't have to be a majority in your area or even politically powerful in your area to exercise this ability to vote with your feet. If there are other jurisdictions somewhere else in the country or some other local government where the policies are better for you or for your group, you can move and take advantage of that even if you don't have any political clout. And this, I think, is of particular relevance for groups that are relatively lacking in political power. And there are, of course, dramatic examples of this in our history, such as African Americans and their migration from the South to the North and the West in the early 20th century. Also, internationally, people like myself and my parents, immigrants from countries with oppressive political systems, in my case, the Soviet Union, but there are many other examples. Saying voting with your feet is a powerful mechanism for those who otherwise lack much political power. Second, there are advantages in terms of information. One of the big themes of my work, I think actually that first drew Heather and me together, is my work on political ignorance, where a big problem with ballot box voting is that most of the public actually is often very ignorant of what they're voting about. I have an entire book that's coming out where I discuss examples of this. I won't bore you with all the particular examples, but they're legion. Just to take one from the current election, when Paul Ryan became the Republican nominee for vice president, surveys showed that close to a majority of people had never even heard of him, and there were probably others who said they had heard of him, but actually hadn't heard of him, but just didn't want to admit it to the pollster. And even though, unlike, say, Sarah Palin in 2008, Ryan has been a major figure in American politics for several years now. Also relevant to Paul Ryan although Ryan and others have been debating the issue of entitlement spending, its relationship to the federal budget, many surveys show that most of the public has no idea or very little idea that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are these enormous chunks of the federal budget. As a result, people tend to believe, many of them, that we can address the budget issue without significantly altering these programs in any way. And I think this is just one of many examples of political ignorance which is out there. Moreover, this ignorance actually turns out to be rational behavior for most voters. Why? Because the chance that your vote will actually have a decisive impact in an election is infinitesimally small. On average, about 1 in 60 million in a presidential election. The odds are somewhat better in other elections, but they're still pretty low. So if your only reason to become informed about politics is to be a better voter, that turns out not to be much of an incentive at all. Now, there's a second aspect of this, and that is that obviously there are people who are interested in politics and they acquire political knowledge for reasons other than voting. Just as I'm a sports fan, for example, and I know a lot about the Boston Red Sox and other baseball teams. I love baseball. I learned that information not to influence the outcome of Red Sox games. This current season shows how little influence I actually have, but because I enjoy cheering on my team and also I enjoy hating the New York Yankees, the opposing team. Yes, that's one of the relatively few issues that David and I agree about. The New York Yankees are evil. If there's nothing you take away from this presentation, nothing else, it should be that point. So I think just as there are sports fans, there are political fans who love to follow politics for much the same kind of reasons that David and I love to follow sports. I think there's nothing wrong with this inherently, but there is a problem. When you're following politics because you're a political fan, rather than because you're trying to get at the truth of who has the best policies or who's the better candidate, then you tend to be highly biased in the way that you evaluate the information. And there's lots of data that show that this is exactly what most people do. When they think about politics, they tend to greatly overvalue any evidence that reinforces their viewpoint and undervalue any evidence that cuts against it. A very well-known study of a few years ago, they surveyed partisan Republicans. They presented them with evidence that WMDs had not actually been found in Iraq, contrary to George W. Bush's predictions that these partisans not only tended to reject that evidence, but in many cases they became even more set in their pre-existing view, which was that WMDs had been found. And I can easily tell you about similar experiments, if we had time, that look at voters on the left who display very similar biases. Now, the advantage in this area of voting with your feet is that when you vote with your feet, you have a much better chance of making a decisive difference when you make your decision. If you're choosing where you're going to live, or if you're in the marketplace choosing what product to buy, most likely have a very good chance of actually having an impact on the decision. That gives you more of an incentive to actually acquire information, and it gives you more of an incentive to be rational in the way that you evaluate it. Rational, unbiased evaluation of information is hard work, and we're more likely to do that hard work when we know it's actually going to make a decisive difference. When I talk to students about this, I often say, if you've ever bought a car or a TV set, did you spend more time choosing your last TV, or did you spend more time and effort deciding who should prevail in the last presidential election? If you're like the vast majority of people, you spent more time on the TV, and you also tried harder to be unbiased in your decision about the TV. Is that because the TV is actually more important or more complicated in the presidency or in control of Congress? No, it's because even if only intuitively, when you bought the TV, you knew that what you were doing was making a decision that would actually have a high probability of making a difference, whereas when you vote in an election, the chance of making a difference is extremely low. So as a result, you probably didn't work as hard at getting information or at controlling your biases. And there's actually dramatic historical evidence that when people vote with their feet, they tend to successfully acquire information, even when the odds are against them. Again, African Americans of 100 years ago in the Jim Crow South are a great example. Even though the average education levels among them were extremely low, acquiring information was much tougher than it is today, and in many cases, southern state governments actually deliberately worked to try to keep them ignorant about better conditions in order to the extent of actually passing laws against people spreading information to them about employment opportunities. Nonetheless, millions of them were able to learn about this, or think about Europeans and Asians who moved to the United States 150 years ago when most of them were also poor, many were illiterate, yet they found the necessary information about conditions being better in the New World than where they actually were. And obviously under modern conditions, the opportunity to get information and get these things right in foot voting is actually much greater than it was during these previous periods. So I think there's a lot to be said for foot voting. Now, of course, foot voting does have disadvantages. The most obvious one is moving costs. And I think moving costs is a real problem, but here's where Heather's federalism all the way down comes in. If you push it all the way down, you have more options available to you while having to move a much shorter distance. So if there are 100 jurisdictions within 50 or 100 or 200 miles, as you can have when you devolve a lot of power to local governments, that gives you much lower moving costs than if you have to go, say, from here to California or whatnot, as in the Grapes of Wrath back in the 1930s. So the Grapes of Wrath is an example of expensive foot voting, but what we want to aim for is cheaper foot voting, and federalism all the way down is not a complete solution to this problem, but I think it helps in a big way. In one of my articles, I actually argued you can push it even further down than Heather suggests by giving more of a role to private organizations and private planned communities where the moving costs are even lower than they are with states and local governments, but I won't go into detail on that here, but I think this is yet a further, even more perhaps Talmudic extension of the Torah that Heather has given us in this area. Now, the next area where I'd like to make an extension or suggest an extension of Heather's theory is in the area of limits on the power of the federal government. I think actually there is a strong synergy between the idea of limiting federal power and the idea of dissenting by deciding and federalism all the way down. The whole point of dissenting by deciding is that there's a group, a minority, whether it's a racial minority, or religious minority, or something else, that has preferences that are different from those of the majority. And so they want to have for them their own enclave, their own area where they can make their decision. Obviously, one important way to facilitate doing that is to prevent the majority at the national level from being able to interfere with what they're doing. If you allow them to interfere, then there's a significant probability that the interference will actually occur and wipe out the experiment in living that happens to be going on, or at least severely constrict it. So I think, therefore, limits on federal power are actually closely coherent and are closely allied with the idea of dissenting by deciding. And I think, at least in my humble opinion as a mere rabbinical interpreter, I think Heather should embrace this idea rather than resist it. But resist it she does. And her concern, which I think is an understandable one, is that if you just limit the federal government's power, then there might be situations where local or state governments engage in various racist or other discriminatory policies, and the center will not be able to do anything about it. I think this is a concern. Obviously, it has recurred in American history, but I don't think the solution to this problem is virtually unconstrained federal power. There's a range of different alternatives as between a federal government as limited as the one we had 200 years ago, or even as limited as the one that existed 70 or 80 years ago, versus what we have under today's Supreme Court doctrine, where the Supreme Court says that Congress can regulate virtually any activity that has any significant effect on the national economy in any way, which is almost any activity other than carrying a gun in a school zone, or perhaps not having health insurance, a couple other things, but it's probably 99.9% of everything else that goes on in our lives. So it seems to me that there's many intermediate points between a very, very tightly limited federal government and one that has almost no limits, and the right point for a theory of dissenting by deciding is going to be somewhere in the middle between those two. At the very least, I think it's going to be far more constraints on the federal government than we currently have. I'm not going to try to expound right now on exactly how much there should be, but I think there is a synergy between constraint on federal power and dissenting by deciding, and also federalism all the way down as well. I would add that this concern that the national government can intervene to harm minorities is not just theoretical. We do see it at many points in American history. One example, I think is particularly potent but not often thought of, comes from the period in the 1930s when we first had the introduction of the modern doctrine of nearly unconstrained congressional power. During that period, the biggest centerpiece of the New Deal centralization was the National Recovery Act, the NRA, not to be confused with the Rifle Association that has the same abbreviation. What the NRA did is it essentially imposed wage and price controls on virtually the entire non-agricultural economy of the U.S., essentially cartelized that entire economy, and the effect of it had many effects actually, but one big effect was it essentially priced out of the market a large number of low-wage workers, many of whom were overwhelmingly African Americans in the South. Indeed, some of the supporters of the NRA, this was part of what they were trying to do to prevent African American labor from competing with white labor. As a result, the impact of the NRA and of several other smaller scale policies like this was actually to throw a large number of minority workers out of work, even a larger number that were already out of work as a result of the Great Depression. So when the Supreme Court invalidated the National Recovery Act in the Schechter Poultry case, although this may not have been their intention, among the biggest beneficiaries were actually minority workers who now at least had somewhat greater opportunities to get a job than they did when the NRA eagle was sort of there at the federal government level overseeing and swooping over the entire economy. There are a number of other dramatic cases like this in American history I can talk about, but I think the key point is that this problem is not just a problem in the theory or the political economy of federalism, it's one that we've actually seen recur in American history. And that brings me to my last major proposed extension of Heather's theory, which I think Heather's theory should be used not just to reevaluate federalism as it exists today, but also to really evaluate what we know or what we think we know about the history of federalism. Because much of what we think we know about federalism is in light not just of the current situation, but in our interpretation of the 200-year history of federalism, which, as I've suggested previously, the conventional wisdom is that federalism is really bad for minorities, particularly racial minorities. Now, I have to admit, there is actually some truth to this conventional wisdom. I don't think it would have become the conventional wisdom if there was no truth to it at all. In particular, it certainly is true that state governments have often oppressed African Americans and other minorities. Asian Americans in the western states is another good example. Very extensive discriminatory legislation against them in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is also true that in the 1860s and in the 1960s, the federal government intervened in a big way to curtail some of the oppressive legislation that the states had enacted, obviously, in the first case abolishing slavery, in the second case abolishing Jim Crow segregation. I think all of this is true. However, by focusing on this, we tend to ignore much of the remaining 180 to 200-year history of American federalism, which I think is also extremely relevant to this discussion of the costs and benefits of federalism for minorities. One thing that we tend to ignore is the federal government's own historical record on race relations and on minorities during the many decades when it was not abolishing slavery or Jim Crow, and that record often is not a very good one. Take, for example, the way the federal government ruled the District of Columbia, the one part of the United States which it has always had plenary power over under received Supreme Court doctrine. It's no accident that the same day the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, they also decided Bowling versus Sharp, dealing with school segregation in D.C. Why? Because D.C. law and D.C.'s policies were just as segregationist as those of most of the southern states, even though D.C. was under complete congressional control. Similarly, before the New Deal, by far the most important federal government institution in American society was the military. The military was overwhelmingly segregated, except for the Marine Corps, which until 1942, I don't want to offend any Marine Corps veterans here, but until 1942, the Marine Corps did not even allow blacks to serve at all. It's not that they segregated them, just didn't let them in at all. So the most important federal government institution of this era then was actually highly segregated. Of course, there's also the shameful record of the federal government's treatment of Native Americans and of course the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, which was undertaken by the federal government. Now, I think many people, certainly most people in this room, are aware of this history, but often we compartmentalize it away from our thinking about the relationship between federalism and race and federalism and minority rights. And to my mind, it should be included in our thinking about these things. We want to look at the federal government's entire record in this area, not just the parts that we like. The parts that we don't like are extremely relevant as well. Moreover, I would say that at a number of crucial periods in American history, racial and ethnic minorities would likely have been even worse off than they actually were if we had had a unitary national policy on race than if we'd had a relatively decentralized federal system. Consider, for instance, the status of slavery at the time of the founding. When the Constitution was proposed in 1787, only one state, the state of Massachusetts, where I grew up in, had actually abolished slavery. So if there had been a unitary national rule on slavery at the time, it would very likely have been slavery everywhere. And that would have made it much more difficult to ever even begin to abolish slavery. Similarly, during much of the period before the Civil War, the federal government was dominated by pro-slavery forces. They enacted laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. If the United States had been a more unitary nation during that period, it is quite possible that policy on slavery and African Americans more generally, including free blacks, would have been worse than it actually was. Southern states and the federal government actually treated free blacks and not just slaves worse than northern states did. For instance, the federal government refused to issue passports to free blacks and otherwise discriminated against them. If we look at the Jim Crow era from the 1880s to, say, the 1940s, one of the striking things about this era is that, as I said before, federal government policy, where it did control issues of race, was actually much closer to what the southern states were doing than to what the northern states were doing. I think that's no accident. It reflects the fact that the southern whites of this era were much more committed to promoting segregation than most northern whites were to opposing it. So if there had been a single unitary national policy during this period on race, it very likely would have been closer to the southern norm than the northern one. It would have been a little bit better, I think, than the southern one, but it would still have been very bad. And moreover, if we had had a unitary policy on race during this period, African Americans and other minorities would not have been able to vote with their feet for a better policy, as millions of them, of course, did. And that, in turn, benefited not just those who moved, but even to some degree, those who stayed behind. There's evidence that when the Great Migration of African Americans really picked up steam in the early 20th century, some southern state governments, for example, were concerned about losing their African American labor. So they certainly did not become racially egalitarian, but they became a little bit better at the margin than they were before. For instance, in the 1920s, some of them began to crack down on lynching against African Americans. Before that period, they just basically said, we don't care if lynching goes on, but when they started losing their labor force, they cared a little bit more. There's some evidence that they also, in some places, began to somewhat improve the state of public education for African Americans as well. I think in a society as racist as the United States was 100 years ago, I think it was inevitable that African Americans and other racial minorities were going to suffer a high degree of discrimination, repression, all the other things that we're familiar with. However, the existence of federalism made that repression somewhat less bad at the margin than it actually was. Much more can be said about the history of federalism in this regard. All I've tried to do here is give you just a small overview of the critique that can be made of the conventional wisdom. It is not my purpose to completely reverse the conventional wisdom and say that federalism was always good for minorities and centralization was always bad. However, I do want to question the traditional wisdom and suggest that there's a lot more variation between different periods and situations than we normally think of to be the case, and recognizing that variation and appreciating it, I think, is an extension of Heather's theory and actually supports her case for the idea that in a variety of circumstances, not in all circumstances, but in a variety, decentralization and federalism can be beneficial to minorities. That is not just, I think, purely a recent reality that's developed in the last 20 or 30 years. That is something we can trace through American history, just as we can also, to some extent, trace it through the history of other countries. So on that note, I think my Talmudic disquisition is for the moment done, but I very much look forward to your questions and to Heather's Word of God responding to us later on in the program. Thank you.